Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to talk about how you can improve your Mythic Plus healing no matter the level. One of the biggest things that comes down to getting better in M Plus is finding how you as a healer can start adjusting your gameplay to the rest of your surroundings. A lot of times for the healer, it's such a great such a great role to be able to play because there is so much flexibility in a Mythic Plus environment with how much you want to be playing defensively, watching out for your teammates, when you can add extra damage, and what sort of decision making that you'll need regarding extra utility that you'll be able to provide towards the team. This is not just for Mistweaver, but you'll see plenty of our footage from the most recent push week, but this also starts reflecting towards my time progressing as Disc throughout most all of BFA, and as progressing as Holy Pally at the end of Legion. Even spending a little bit of time, of course, playing some Rested Druid. One of the biggest things that comes down to starting to get into these better groups, these more consistent groups, is, and one of the things that I always hear all the time is, well, I wish my group didn't take as much damage as, the way that yours doesn't. And I sort of smile because I know how much damage my group can take in a lot of cases, but it's definitely true that at lower levels, failure damage is extremely high, and it can often be healed through, so the expectation is for the healer to heal through it at that level. As you go higher and higher, the level of care that a healer must take is always very important, but the level of forgiveness for a lot of those abilities is not by any means. Many times, if you're taking extra failure damage, you're just going to get one-shot or comboed by unavoidable damage or things that you might need to predict, and that just doesn't end up being conducive to chesting any sort of keys. Getting into these groups that are more willing to learn is all about networking. Making sure that when you're getting into these pugs, you're friending some of the better players in the group, the ones who are communicating, the ones who have a good route in mind, the ones who are studying other people at higher levels and studying their peers. Finding the people that are going to be good companions for you as you want to progress is always very important. Because when you're looking at spending long hours playing together, or a continued or stressful session, you want to be able to have people around you, quite frankly, that you enjoy being around, that you can tolerate, and that you want to be able to work with. Getting there is always getting there is not as easy as it sounds, it's not easy as just saying it, but it's more of a continued process to start building relationships with other people and, making it an MMO. This isn't a single player game, and you need to be able to start building those relationships consistently and keeping an up-to-date friends list of people who are always interested in doing keys, progressing, learning, and growing. As you start getting into more of those consistent teams, knowing what to expect and what your job is starts kind of developing and evolving over time. Like I mentioned, when you're into that 18 to 22 range, or 22 to range and downwards even, there's a lot of failure damage that can just straight up be healed through by the healer. And with how powerful everybody is these days, with the power of sockets, stat amplifiers, just raw corruption damage, in many cases, you are able to just kick back and heal through a lot of the content, and you will be a-okay. Even at some of the highest levels, some healers just don't really deal all that much damage, even though they should, because the damage checks aren't as tight. But again, depends on the dungeon that you're going into. So as you're getting towards that 22, 23 level, your priority is definitely going to be healing through people as much as you possibly can. But that's also where you want to be making sure, especially when you have a consistent team, you're providing those reminders to people that, oh, you almost died there on the 21, 22. You will definitely die or become even closer to dying as we progress, as you start going farther. A lot of times this is an area where you start looking at how good some of your DPS are at using their defensives, and guiding them is always a very key component for a healer. I am always very astute, and I try to be as astute as possible with saying, hey, here's my expectations for the next double that Corgus is going to give us. Here's the CD rotation we're using for Kragmaw. Here's what we're going to be doing on Sand Queen, right? What your expectations are for people using their defensives and setting up their defensives, even for things like Rumble, for example, out of King Gabamak in Junkyard, are always incredibly important to making sure that you are going to be able to keep everybody alive through the incoming damage. One of the biggest things as well is getting to the point where you know how everybody's defensives work and what they best mitigate. Turtle's a great example of an immunity that kind of isn't, where there are some pieces of damage that it will prevent, and there's some that it just kind of sort of reduces the damage of. Knowing which dungeons it is going to be best at, which situations it's going to be best at, when you want to be using Netherwalk, Cloak of Shadows, Ice Block, Paladin Bubble, any of these resources is always going to be incredibly important for making sure that the group is going to be able to survive, making sure that they're going to be able to get the most out of their value. One of the things that a healer always should be doing is watching how much damage that they're going to be taking as well. Being the first one to start putting on Avoidant Corruption, being the first one to go and start moving towards Versatile Corruption as well. Reducing your own damage intake is also going to be a great pathway to start looking at how can you optimize your damage, how can you best stretch out your mana, and how can you reduce a lot of the healing that is required from you in the group. One of the things from this specific situation, running with a Brewmaster, we often talk about how we want to use our cooldowns. When I run the reduced cooldown for Life Cocoon, I am often using that, and I'm trying to separate that from our tank's Psychic Shell Trinket, because they're both absorbs and they're both good stops to the incoming damage that happens. So it makes it a lot easier for me to be able to communicate with him, saying, I'm going to be constantly using my cocoon, and then you're going to have better control over when you want to use your Psychic Shell, and then you're going to have these things at your disposal. When you start looking at other cooldowns, sometimes tanks are very quick to be able to call them, and sometimes they need a nudge. Knowing some of the body language as well of when Ring of Peace is best able to be used, when you should Shining Force off the tank, knock things into a wall, when they might need a grip to be able to gain a bit of extra separation. All of these things become key factors. Watching for specific debuffs like the Corruption Slow in the case of monks or paladins, so that you can use Freedom or you can use Tiger's Lust to break them out of that situation, goes very far into making the most out of your run and making the most out of your utility for the group. Communication is absolutely crucial. When it comes to it, you need to be the one to start goading your DPS, pushing your DPS to use the defenses properly at the precise moments that they're needed as you're making that sort of call. Damage often, I think, is underestimated for healers, and knowing when you're going to be able to cut those extra corners and add some extra damage is always going to be of profound importance. When you're setting yourself up for essences, or really any sort of borrowed power systems, whether it's next expansion with legendaries, you want to look at which legendaries are going to be more beneficial from a damaging perspective and which are more safe. And my litmus test, since there's no gear swapping, unfortunately, you have to look at the most scary encounter in the dungeon and build yourself specifically for that one. Over the years, I often had trouble healing fights like Galvatst or healing fights like Overseer Korgus, and I always looked to build myself specifically for those fights, even if it came a little bit to the detriment of everything else. That's because you'd hate to be able to get to the very end boss, not be able to zone out or not have time to zone out, and you just don't have the resources that you need. Going into Shadowlands, we're going to be faced with a very similar situation where resources are going to be scarce, and we're not going to be having loads of external mana or massive healer power at our disposal in order to get the job done. As a result, you need to be able to play even more conservatively in order to keep people alive, which goes to reducing your own damage, playing more safe with legendaries, and doing whatever it takes to help everybody out. Like I mentioned before, cooldown usage is incredibly important, and many people are shy to use their own defensives or their own externals that frequently. You might see, for example, with Resto Druid, Mistweaver Monk, a lot of those 1.5 minute cooldowns that you'll see coming up get used, single digits, 7 or 8 times over a 30 or 40 minute dungeon. That's really not going to cut it as you go higher. Using a lot of these extra defensives makes a considerable difference, and you'll even notice a much easier time healing incoming damage. One of the things I see a lot of times when coaching Disc Priests is they never really use Rapture enough. Having the extra absorption effect makes a considerable difference and makes it a lot easier to be able to make the most of your healing and to start smoothing out a lot of that incoming damage. Start looking at some of that utility, and as you start watching some other healers who are playing at a high level, and look at how they're keeping their defensives on cooldown. even a preemptive use in dungeons like Motherlode, where you have charges, you have grease guns, you have random damage and cleaves all over the place. Preemptive use of them and more predictive use of when damage might happen to you will just save your life in a lot of cases, because there is so much that you have to be worrying about. Once again, for Mistweaver Monk, you have 2 great defensives in Diffuse or Dampen Harm, and you always have Fortifying Brew. Spacing those out and knowing what to look for is always an incredibly big key component. Paladins often run with a lot of ineffable truth, so that's cooldown reduction not only for wings, not only for shock, but also for divine protection. You have these at your disposal, and, Druid no different with the on-demand jump into bear form. While it's not as strong as it was in Legion, it's still a sizable amount of HP and armor, and you have access to a minute CD on Ironbark as well, so you're constantly able to, actually Barkskin, you're constantly able to provide extra defensives to yourself and start focusing on everybody else in your group just a little bit more. Be sure to be adding damage when you can, as it's always going to be helpful when you're getting into these dungeons, but think about what level of dungeons that you're at, where you're progressing, and where you want to be going, as those are often going to be very significant towards helping out a lot of the members of your group. Again, communication is going to be making the biggest difference, really, in my experience, and getting keys chested faster, more rapidly, and working to make sure you're keeping the team together when any sort of tilt sets in. You guys, if anybody starts going into longer and longer key sessions, you'll know firsthand it gets very frustrating whenever you're not hitting some of your goals, whenever things aren't going right. But getting people back to the table, getting people back on the same page always makes a considerable difference and helps keep the team together. Don't be afraid of those failures. Don't be afraid of those scuffing keys and everything like that, because they will happen, and every single team that is considered the top in the world makes mistakes, scuffs keys, learns from it, comes back, and gets all the better. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any other questions or any other tips that you'd like to see, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. And be sure to check out the live stream, as we'll be doing plenty of M+ on beta and on live servers as the weeks permit. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'll catch y'all next time.